if we're calling something imposter syndrome when it's really imposter treatment, we are misidentifying it. And then we're going to reach for the kind of tool or solution that helps us overcome imposter syndrome when it's not the fact that we're feeling like we don't know, it's the fact that they're treating us like we don't belong.
You're listening to the Life Edit Project podcast, where busy, ambitious high achievers get the tools they need to fight perfectionism and overwhelm so they can smash their goals without all the drama. I'm your host, recovering overachiever turned professional life coach, Elizabeth Burrows. Let's get to it.
Good day, good people. Welcome back to the Life Edit Project podcast. This is episode 66 of the show. I'm super excited because I have a very special guest with me today. Her name is Whitney Knox Lee, and she is actually the host of the Impostrix Podcast, which if you have not listened to that show, add that one to your playlist. It is bomb.com. All of my listeners should be listening to that one too, because if you like me, you'll definitely like her. And I brought Whitney on. Whitney, I brought you on today because I have been meaning to get around to the topic of imposter syndrome. And your entire podcast started on the premise of imposter syndrome. And then also something that I want to ask you about imposter treatment, because those two things are not the same. And then I think you talk about all of those things under the umbrella of imposter experiences, which I love. I just love that so much. So we have so many things to talk about. And y'all, what y'all don't know is that Whitney and I have been chatting. We were chatting for like 45 minutes before I hit record. So we have so many things to say, but we're going to try to keep this podcast episode size for y'all today. But Whitney, tell the people about yourself. Introduce yourself, please.
We literally started talking 45 minutes ago. That is not an exaggeration. But yes, thank you so much for having me on the show, Elizabeth. My name, like she said, is Whitney Knox Lee. I am a multi-hyphenate at this point. I asked me where I thought I would be a year ago, and I would not have ever guessed this. So I'm a podcast host. I am an attorney. I just recently opened a legal practice called Wills for the People here in Georgia. We do estate planning and help facilitate the transfer of wealth for Black and Brown families and moderate income families in Georgia. I am also a race equity consultant, and that is really how I got into this conversation around imposter syndrome, imposter treatment, and how we experience that as folks of color. Myself, I identify as a Black American woman. I am a Black mother to Black boy children. I have a Black husband, so we Black, we Black, Black. And I say these things because they are all really important to my identity as far as how I experience the world around me and the things that I have to think about when I'm thinking about what career means to me, what money and wealth means to me, what schooling means to me and my family, what, healthcare, what politics, like all of this stuff affects Black mothers of Black children with Black men that they love in a very unique way. And so that is a big part of my identity that I like to share because I don't want it to be, I don't think it can be overstated. So that is who I am.
Yes. Yeah. I have to do a big old cosign around that. So I'm also a Black woman, and I'm also married to a Black man. I am mother to a Black girl. I don't have any sons, but I am an auntie to several Black boys and now some Black men because they're adults, and that makes me feel old. But so I'm also really active, like in my church. I'm one of the youth leaders at my church, and so I like to think, at least in some cases, I'm in charge of, many Black children. And in some cases, I'm acting as a role model to them or an
Mhm.
instructor of some type. And all of that matters a whole lot. And I bring those identities with me also into this conversation. And I also bring the identity of coach into, especially here at the my show, the Life Edit Project podcast. I bring the identity of coach because I'm here not just to talk about everything from my personal perspective, but I'm here to present all of these things through a lens that will actually help my listeners learn something about themselves and help resolve some type of challenge in their own lives. Um, Informed by my own personal experiences, but also the experiences that all of the clients that I've coached in the past have also had. And let me tell y'all, if you feel like you're the only one struggling with imposter syndrome, you ain't the only one. You are not it at all. You are not alone. And so I figured I'd go ahead and just bring the expert on this topic here to the show. Yeah. So, okay. So let's start here for this conversation. How do you define imposter syndrome?
Yeah. So, and let me start by saying, y'all did not hear me say psychologist because I am not a psychologist. In fact, I all but failed Psych 101 in college because I don't do brains. I don't do that. Okay. So, my understanding with imposter syndrome is through my own personal experiences and through the research that I've started doing as a Black professional, as a Black attorney, really working in the Deep South, working in civil rights law, where oftentimes I am working to protect people of color from states and systems that really just want to harm people of color. So that's where I'm coming from my understanding of imposter syndrome. But what it was coined in the 1970s, late 1970s, by two white female psychologists, actually here in Atlanta, Pauline Clance and Suzanne Imes. And they were studying their clients, a group of their clients who were white women, high achieving, middle class to upper class women. And when I say high achieving, these were people like doctors or people in med school or lawyers or people with advanced degrees or, geniuses, stuff like that. What they found in speaking to their clients was that even though their clients were amazing, clearly, they still felt like they weren't. They felt as though they were frauds and their intellectual capacity or their intellectual level really wasn't what it looked like. Even though they had all of these accolades that they had, gained over the years, the degrees, maybe the inventions, the successes, all of that stuff didn't really matter to them when they were considering their own ability. And so one of the key points of imposter syndrome is that you feel intellectually like a fraud and that the external, your external accomplishments are a fluke, essentially.
Mm-hmm.
That your true capability is much lower than what you've actually achieved. And you achieved the thing because it was a fluke. And further, that when you actually suck at doing something, that's your true capability. Is getting the C instead of the A.
Mm-hmm.
And so there are, multiple characteristics of imposter syndrome. But essentially the thought was that this is an internal phenomenon. I believe they don't feel like it's a psychological
right
thing.
Yeah.
It's not a psychological diagnosis type of situation. But it's an internal situation. It can come from your upbringing and what kind of household you grew up in, and what the expectations of you were in the household. It can come from a feeling of insecurity and low self-esteem. It can come from the environment that you're in and whether you're navigating a high degree of I don't know, I'm just gonna call it genius environment with professionals and whatnot who operate at a very high level. So that's the basic. You think that you're an intellectual fraud, even though everything says that you're not.
Yeah. 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 I think it's so interesting how so one, the fact that it's not an actual psychological diagnosis does not mean that this syndrome does not exist, right? And I think it's really important to emphasize that point. Like the fact that it has a name and the fact that when you say it, people know what it means and people identify with it and it resonates means that it is common enough that we should pay attention to it and take it seriously, right? And understand what it means to us and how and whether it impacts our own lives. And, the same is true for another topic that I've spent a lot of time on, Superwoman syndrome. So, Superwoman syndrome, similarly, it's a concept that was coined by someone back in the 80s, but it's not a psychological diagnosis. I did actually think it was episode 2 of this show that I did a whole deep dive on how I define Superwoman syndrome. Um, but yeah, it's the kind of thing where it's a syndrome because there are symptoms of it, right? And with imposter syndrome, the what I'm hearing you say is the big symptom is feeling like you don't belong where you are despite evidence to the contrary.
Yep, yep, and specifically having to do with your intellectual capability.
Yeah, that's
As
that's
opposed to
interesting.
like, their consideration, Pauline Clance and Suzanne Imes, they weren't considering race. I think to some extent they were not. I think they were considering gender because this was a gendered study,
Hmm.
and so actually early on it was thought that like just women experienced imposter syndrome. Also, it's actually so the technical term of art is imposter phenomenon.
Mm,
Syndrome just got added on, instead of phenomenon, because I think probably that was easier. But
right.
some of their recent work talks about how they felt like syndrome is misleading because it's not
Mm,
a syndrome, but it is a phenomenon that we experience.
hmm.
Um, and to your point about the superwoman experience syndrome,
Hmm.
there are 5 types of imposter syndrome, or there are 5 types of personalities or characteristics, if you will. There is the soloist, so the person that if they can't do something by themselves, then the act of getting help is proof that they suck.
Mm,
And that just shows that they're an imposter. There's the expert, so they might have some specific areas of expertise. And if there's information within that expertise that they do not know, they feel like a fake. So they are like hyper focused on knowing everything about these specific areas of expertise. And when they have to reach other resources to continue to expand their understanding, they feel like an imposter. Um, there is the superhuman, the person that thinks that they can just do all the things. And when there's a thing that they can't do, that they're not successful at, that they're not good at, um, they suck. They're horrible and they're imposters. The perfectionist, and that is the person who struggles with perfectionism. And when they complete something, if it is not perfect, then they're horrible people and stupid and dumb and imposters. And then there is the natural genius. So these are the people that think that they literally come out the womb knowing the things. These are like the super genius smart people who really don't have to try hard to retain information that they're learning. So if you're somebody that maybe has like a photographic memory, but now you can't remember something all of a sudden, that may make you feel as though you're an imposter, and that maybe it is that photographic memory that makes you the genius. And so
mm,
if you're no longer in tune with that, or if you don't have the memory, then now you're an imposter. So those are the 5 types: the soloist, the expert, the superhuman, the perfectionist, and um, the natural genius. And I think, each aspect is really interesting. I, for myself, find I am a mix of the superhuman and the perfectionist. And I think being a mom is part of that. Because in my household, being a mom does mean being super. It means being a super person. It means doing, all the things. As much as my husband does participate in our family life and all of that, I'm still the primary parent. I'm the primary parent. I work. I have a full time, situation I got going on. And other responsibilities that make it so that I basically am Superwoman. And then not only that, I want everything to be perfect. And it's really difficult for me to let go of perfectionism. So often my imposter syndrome comes up where I am comparing myself to other moms in particular, or where I'm comparing my work product, maybe like how it looks. Like, don't get me started on Canva, but maybe I'm comparing my Canva flyer with somebody else's Canva flyer. And I notice that they capitalized all the words and I forgot to, then I'm going to be like, I am so dumb. I am an imposter. So you're laughing, but that's how
it's so relatable. It's so relatable. It's so relatable. I think if you were to ask my husband, he would probably say that the soloist is an aspect for me. He likes to remind me, hi, I'm here. You don't have to do everything on your own. And I don't know that I think I need to do it all on my own, or else it doesn't count. I think I assume that he would prefer it if I did it all on my own. And that is therefore how I should do it in order to make things go as smoothly as possible. So I actually, what I think that is, this is interesting. I think that's probably the superhuman aspect that looks like the soloist. Right?
Because do you get maybe validation through being able to do all the things?
Yeah. I think the more that I feel like I am successfully juggling, the more validated I feel in life, the more successful I feel. And when something falls through the cracks, I am very hard on myself. Very, very hard on myself. And I am most likely to think, oh my gosh, this is unrecoverable. I am not going to be able to recover from this mistake here. This opportunity here is dead. This meal is trash, right? Right? My career is over. My marriage is ending.
Yeah, my kids hate me.
Yeah. No, I've ruined my daughter, right? Yeah. Those are the thoughts. Yes. Yeah. That's really interesting. I think it's really important for everyone to understand that imposter phenomenon doesn't look the same in everyone. And I'm also willing to bet, I ain't researched this one tiny iota, but I'm willing to bet that it can also look different over different phases of life.
Oh yeah. And what I notice, so in my podcast, the format is that I have people on, I interview these people. They are from all walks of life and with different professional or career choices. But they're all people of color. I only host people of color on the show. And in our conversations, oftentimes I'm asking them about imposter treatment, imposter experiences, or imposter syndrome. And I find that older folks, they're able to talk about it, but they're talking about it as if it was in the past. Also, I've talked to people who are not born in the United States, who spent a significant amount of time growing up outside of the United States, who then come to the United States, who do not experience imposter syndrome the way that I experience it. And the person that sticks out the most to me is actually one of my old professors who I interviewed, Dr. Ruth White, she's Jamaican, talked about she grew up around Black people. Blackness was the norm. The Blackness, as far as how she describes it, I've since learned that Black Americanness is a culture in and of itself.
Yes.
Which I didn't realize when I started the podcast. I thought everybody just identified as Black if you had dark skin, but no.
Nope.
No. So anyways, so she grew up feeling, knowing, understanding that she belonged everywhere that she went. And that her
That's not been my experience at all.
Right. I couldn't even imagine. I couldn't imagine until moving to Atlanta and Georgia, not being the only Black person in a room, because that was my experience growing up in the Northwest, was frequently being the only Black person in any given space, whether it was on a bus or in a classroom or on the soccer field. So anyways, I digress. All of this is to say that our upbringing, our culture really does impact, I think, how we experience imposter syndrome, that internal feeling of being an imposter versus imposter treatment is that external, other people are treating you as if you don't belong or as if you are an imposter. And so it's really amazing having those conversations and hearing from people like, no, I have not experienced them. People have told me they have not experienced imposter, and I'm just like, how? I thought everybody experienced this. Clanton I'm said 70% of people experience it. I thought 100% of people experienced it. Some people are like, nah, white men don't experience this. I don't know, but yeah.
That reminds me, this was several years ago, and I was talking about something with my boss at the time, and she was a white woman, a wonderful person. We had an interesting work relationship, but by that time, we had grown to be pretty close, and we had a very good working relationship. And I had so much respect for her, and she had so much respect for me. And she had a career path that was full of like some challenges, interesting challenges that she had overcome and whatnot, but lots of bumps kind of along the road. And so I said something to her one day about imposter syndrome, and she looked at me perplexed, and she was like, "What?" And I said, "Imposter syndrome. That feeling where you feel like you're not good enough or you don't belong, or like, you have what you have and it's going to be taken from you when they find out who you really are." Whatever. And she was like, no. And I was like, wait. I was like, are you telling me that you've just never heard of this? Or are you telling me that you don't get it? And she was like, she was like, both. She was like, I've never heard of that. But she was like, I also don't understand that at all. I was like, what does that feel like? That was my thought. I walked away from that interaction saying, I have to reevaluate my whole idea of her, my whole take on her, because she's over here missing a fundamental thing that I thought we bonded over.
No, you're the only one that thinks that you ain't good enough. Like, not her.
There's very interesting. I want to touch on a couple of things that you said. One, I do think we need to spend some time differentiating between imposter phenomenon versus imposter treatment, because I think that's a really important distinction that people should understand, because they are not the same thing. And then, given that everyone does not experience it, and that it can there are 5 different aspects to it, I am curious to hear your thoughts on how and whether Black women experience imposter phenomenon differently than, let's say, other women who are not Black women.
Yeah. Okay, so with your first question first, yes, I had been calling all of the feelings that I was feeling imposter syndrome or imposter phenomenon until I read a book by Elizabeth Leba called I'm Not Yelling. Elizabeth Leba is a Black woman.
I know who she is. I follow her.
Yes. Her book, it has something after the colon, but I can't remember what it is. But it's essentially about the treatment of Black women at work and how we're having to navigate between strong Black women and angry Black women, those 2 stereotypes. And, the different ways that she experienced that at work. And imposter syndrome was one of those ways, but she made this point of distinguishing between whether or not you are an imposter, whether or not you're an imposter or people are treating you like an imposter. And that was really, really helpful for me, because we all, at least here in America, I'm just going to speak. I'm not even going to speak for myself. I'm going to speak for every Black person up here who grew up in America. We were taught you got to be twice as good to get half as
Half
far.
as far. Yep.
What that means for us, how we have internalized that is we have literally done twice as much. We have literally got extra degrees or studied more or worked more hours or, there's some aspect of how we have gotten to where we are, specifically professionally and educationally, that goes above and beyond what your average white person has done. So that being said, we also know that Black women are among the most educated demographic in the United States. So when we take that background and then think about being an imposter and acknowledging that imposterism is talking about like the intellectual ability, like how can that even be possible? How can it be the case? And yes, okay, so there are times where I'm not prepared, where maybe I've entered into a new field of my law practice. I have experience with that type of law and I'm learning it. And so when I go to a class or a conference or a courtroom and I've only been practicing that area of law for 2 weeks and everybody else has been practicing for 2 years or 10 years, yes, I am going to feel like I don't know as much because I don't. That is different than imposter phenomenon, which is I know just as much as you, I just feel like I don't. So like first, let's just distinguish between when we're not prepared or when we actually don't have the knowledge and when we have the knowledge, but we feel like we don't. So I think that that's number one. But as far as, and so for me, like I'll call that an imposter. No, I won't even call it imposter anything. I'll just call it I'm new.
Yeah.
Like, hey, I'm new here.
Being a beginner, right?
Yeah.
It's not an imperfection to be a beginner. It's not a shortcoming. Right. Yes.
That is a part of the process. And so what are the steps that we need to take to build our confidence in that area? That is just straight professional development or educational development or parental development or whatever. So let's not call that imposter syndrome or imposter phenomenon or imposter anything because we're not imposters when we're in that situation. Okay.
Yes.
Then when we think about the history of Blackness in the United States or the history really of non-whiteness, because here we're not even talking specifically about Blackness. Let's talk about the history of non-whiteness, which is if you are not white, you have been persecuted. If you are not white in the United States, there have been times throughout history and possibly even still today, if you're a Black person or an indigenous person, where there are systems in place set up so that you are never going to enter that room of power, so that you are never going to be as successful as a white person, so that you are never going to be as free, as liberated as a white person. Our entire country is situated upon laws, practices, policies, whether written or not, that are meant to keep non-white people subjugated to white people. So now, as quote professionals, as people who are maybe successful, as people who maybe are middle class or anything but what is expected of us, what the stereotype is of us, of like the welfare queen, or, if you're an immigrant, people that are just mooching off of, I don't know, Americans. So I don't even know what to say about immigrants anymore. Like, I don't know. If you are anything other than what society has told you you are going to be, then you are an imposter. Because it is the fact that you do not belong. This space was not meant for you to be there. So, for example, I'm a lawyer. I litigate. I used to litigate. Meaning I used to be in court representing people. I am in the Deep South. the Deep South is like the start of the place where Black people aren't supposed to have power and be in courtrooms in the position that I'm in. If we're going to be in a courtroom, first of all, we're going to be under the courtroom. Secondly, we're not going to be in a place where our voice matters, where we can even speak, where we're safe to speak. If we speak, we might be lynched on our way home. If we make it to a courtroom, it's going to be about a property issue and not about a safety issue. And so, literally, I'm not, this country, this United States of America, was not situated in a space, in a way for me to be able to be the advocate, the person with power in a courtroom. So when I walk into the courtroom and everybody else is white and the judge is white and the only people who look like me are the people that are sitting in the jury box, because that's where people are held before they have to take the stand. In like, you know, that's just where people are held sometimes. I'm going to feel like an imposter.
Yeah.
When every picture on the wall of the judges of the past 100 years are a whole bunch of old white dudes, and I'm not an old white dude, I am going to feel like an imposter. So for me, and what Elizabeth Leba talks about is that this isn't an internal feeling of, I don't have the intellectual knowledge. This is being treated like I don't belong.
It's observing the fact that the environment is such that they don't expect you to be. Yeah, you don't belong.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So, and when you're in that type of space, that's when people might start saying things like calling you girl. I've been called girl in court. Asking if I'm an attorney instead of like assuming that I'm an assistant or a client. Making me go through the security situations while not making white men go through security. And so that is where the treatment too starts to come in, is like, you are being treated like an other. But again, this is not having to do with intellectual capacity. This is just having to do with, you know, centuries of, marginalization and racism and my Black skin and I'm a female and blah, blah, blah. And so I think that to answer your question, this is a very long-winded way of saying there are experiences that can feel like imposter syndrome, maybe like, or that we have been calling imposter syndrome, that it is very okay for us to flip the switch on that entirely. And then ask ourselves, like, how often do we really experience imposter syndrome? How often do I really experience where I know the thing, but I don't feel like I do? And maybe that happens a little bit. Like, that's fine. But it doesn't happen as often as I think it is. Instead, it's, I'm new here, or you're treating me like I'm an imposter.
This is so good. So one thing that I have said multiple times on this podcast is that being able to correctly diagnose the problem, correctly identify the problem, is paramount to being able to apply the right solution, right? And so if we're calling something imposter syndrome when it's really imposter treatment, right? We are misidentifying it, and then we're going to reach for the kind of tool or solution that helps us overcome imposter syndrome, when it's not the fact that we're feeling like we don't know, it's the fact that they're treating us like we don't belong. And so it doesn't matter how much extra belief I instill in myself about, you know, the fact that I belong here or whatever, it's not going to change how other people treat me, right? And so it's very, very important to learn that distinction. So it's akin to it's akin to the difference between identifying a nail and a screw, right? So if you have a screw and you're trying to build something, a screw requires a drill or a screwdriver, right? Something that has like a Phillips head or a flathead screwdriver where you can literally screw it in. Whereas a nail, you just need a hammer to bam, bam, bam. If you try to apply your hammer to a screw and bam, 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 you're not going to get the result that you're looking for. Likewise, if you take your flathead screwdriver to a nail, it's not going to give what you think it's supposed to give. And so it becomes really, really important for us to be able to tell the difference between things that look similar and maybe they perform a similar function in our lives, but they're actually different. Really, really important.
Yeah. And I think, I mean, you know better than I, like the power of mindset. And, you know, that's why it's so important for us to say, this isn't imposter syndrome. This is, I'm new and inexperienced, or I'm a first. I'm a first Black person in this. I'm a first Black judge. I'm a first Black doctor in my community or in, you know, in this space. The other thing that I want to mention is, I'm getting into somatics recently. This like really being more in tune with my body, with my physical body, and aligning or like connecting the dots between what I'm feeling, what I'm saying, and like intellectually what I'm thinking and what my body is feeling. And realizing too that times when I feel like an actual imposter, often when those situations are happening, it's more nervousness. So, for example, at a speaking engagement, speaking is something that I've started doing recently, and people actually want to give me money, right? Okay. So, I have what one might call imposter syndrome about whether or not like I am qualified to speak and be paid for it. So let's break this down, because they're asking me to speak about a thing that I know a lot about diversity, equity, and inclusion within a nonprofit law firm. I know a lot about that because that's how I got into race equity work, was working on equity initiatives within a nonprofit law firm. I have since gone on and done trainings where I'm learning. I've also given lots of trainings. I've served as a consultant. I've served as a coach. I've written articles. I've done a number of things, right? So I have the information to be able to share. I don't really mind speaking. I speak a lot. I got a podcast. My profession requires that I talk a lot. Like I can't be a lawyer and not talk, at least not the kind of lawyer that I want to be. But I'm going to be standing in front of 200 people sharing with them these things. I'm nervous about that. And I'm surprised that they want to pay me. And I think that that's okay. Like I don't think that that's imposter syndrome. I think that I'm speaking to a crowd of people and I'm a little bit nervous about that. And oh my gosh, I made it to the point in my career where people actually want to pay me to talk. Okay.
So good. So good. I did a whole episode sometime here in season 2 about being a beginner. And kind of cultivating beginner's mindset, because I am speaking to lots of overachievers. I'm a chronic overachiever myself, although I'm in recovery, I like to say. I'm speaking to a lot of recovering perfectionists, right? And one of the challenges that so many in my community face is that their expectations of themselves are so high that when they are venturing into new territory, when they are growing beyond something that they have already mastered, they are expecting themselves to start at the expert level. And that's just, unless you are the quote unquote natural genius, right? Starting at expert is just not a thing. It's not a thing. And it's not a problem that it's not a thing. It's only a problem when we believe that anything less than mastery is insufficient at the beginning. And so we just get to cultivate the belief that it's okay to be a beginner, especially when you're on a trajectory of learning and improving and developing mastery, because let's face it, that's what our people do. Right. That's what we do. I'm not going to put myself in a situation where, you're not going to accept a speaking engagement where you feel like you're going to have an unresearched topic, an unplanned discussion where you're just going to get up there and improvise. I'm guessing that's not going to be how you approach any of your speaking engagements.
Nope. Wouldn't do that to myself.
Right. And so that type of failure that we're so afraid of usually isn't a real possibility. What we need to make room for is the growth curve. that
Yeah.
comes with being at the beginning, and looking forward to the upward climb, right? It's not always comfortable, but it does go up. It doesn't always flatline. And sometimes the upward curve looks like peaks and valleys, looks like the stock market, right?
Yeah.
And sometimes that is what the journey toward mastery looks like. And having one of those little dips also does not mean that you are an imposter.
Right. And, this reminds me always when I talk about perfectionism and like this mastery of a thing, even though you're a beginner, reminds me of my son and when he was taking karate classes. He hated karate classes, not because he hated karate, but because he wasn't perfect, because he wasn't like a black belt or whatever the higher belts were. He didn't have a belt. Okay. Like we didn't even buy him the outfit because we were like, how is this going to go? Sure enough, he hated it. Every session, he would cry. He would have full-blown temper tantrums because he didn't like that he couldn't do what he saw other kids and expert karate ninjas, whoever, doing on TV. And it's so similar for us as adults when we are entering spaces. So let's talk about entrepreneurship because you own a business.
Oh boy.
I just started a business. What I don't know, maybe somebody tells some new entrepreneurs this, but like it took some months of entrepreneurship before somebody was suddenly like, you don't start at 10. Like you're the product, the service, the whatever that you're providing when you are starting as an entrepreneur is the minimum viable product, right? It's the minimum thing with the most basic of the whistles and bells that you are putting out there. But what we do as entrepreneurs, our expectation of ourselves is that instead of, the basic model of the car, we're putting out the car with the bells and the whistles and the leather seats and the seat warmers and
all of that.
Right. You press the button and the seat moves to adjust. Right. And that's not, so I'm still trying to just be okay with the minimum viable product because the minimum viable product is not going to be perfection. Like it's not going to be in your head what you think. Like you can, and I hope I will, release a perfect minimum viable product. But it's going to be, what perfect means is basic. Like it's going to be basic. It's going to be perfectly basic. It's going to work how it needs to work. It's going to help the person do what they need it to do. And it's going to keep it moving. But is it going to be the absolute prettiest thing you've ever seen? No. Is it going to be self-published? Yes. Is it, because we don't have, it's the first one. It's the first thing. And what we're comparing to, because what we see on the market are iterations 10.0.
Yeah.
We're not looking at iteration 1.0 because iteration 1.0 for that business was 5 years ago when they had $0. Now they have $2 million.
Mm-hmm. And they've removed all traces of 1.0 from the internet.
Right. So when we're talking about our professional spaces, our career spaces, the spaces where we are making our living, and the beginner's mindset is so important because if we're telling ourselves that we're not beginners, that we should know better, that we should be perfect, that we should be able to do all the things that our boss or even our colleague who has been in the field for 10 years longer than us can do, then the only thing we can tell ourselves is that we're not good enough, that we are imposters. Right. And how is that going to impact how I'm actually showing up? So when thinking about going back to my example about being a speaker, if I'm preparing and showing up to the speaking engagement, telling myself that I'm an imposter, how am I going to show up compared to if I'm preparing for the speaking engagement, telling myself that I know exactly what I'm going to say, that I've read some up-to-date articles that are really applicable to this specific organization, that I have practiced what I'm going to say and how I'm going to speak and how quickly or slowly I'm going to try and speak, that I have some engagement examples, that I belong there, that they want me there out of everybody that they could have hired, and that I'm prepared. Like what I say and how I say it, the vibe that I'm entering in the room with, the energy that I'm bringing with me, with that mindset, is going to be much different than the vibe that I'm entering the room with the I'm an imposter. I can't believe they want me here. I better make this shit sound real good, or else somebody's gonna find out. They're gonna tell everybody and their mom, and I'm never gonna get hired again.
Yeah, yeah. It's so important. It's so important. And you said so many, so many good things. So even though we're clear that imposter phenomenon isn't just one thing, and it doesn't just show up in just one way, and we're also clear that there are lots of things that we've probably been calling imposter syndrome that are actually something else, that are actually not us finding ourselves to be inadequate for where we are, but it's something else that's environmental, or it's something else that is external and not internal to us, right? So even though we're clear on all of that, it is still really important to understand and to recognize that your mindset can play a huge role in how successfully you navigate imposter experiences.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, that is so good. Okay, so to that vein, do you have any tips for how someone who, let's say, identifies as a recovering perfectionist, on how they might navigate imposter experiences better?
Yeah. So what I try and do for myself now is really start out with the identifying what it is. Am I actually feeling imposter syndrome, imposter phenomenon? Or is there something else that's happening? If I can identify that there's something else that's happening, then I can also identify a solution to that thing. So if it's that I am a beginner, then adopting the beginner mindset and doing the work, that we do when we're learning a thing to help to get me comfortable, and just remembering when I'm walking into the thing that it's not that I'm an imposter, it's that I'm new. Um, if it's imposter treatment, I'm entering into a space and I feel like a fraud just by being in that space, or if somebody is treating me like I clearly do not belong, you must not be an attorney because you're a young Black woman, you must be lost, blah, 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 blah. What are the things that I can do to like pump myself up going into that space? How can I get grounded? A business coach recently asked me, or she was asking our like group to reflect on this question. What practice do I use to embody abundance? And like, this is for people who are out there trying to make money, right? So like, we want abundance. But if you are in another capacity, like just thinking about what are the things, what practices can I use in real time that can help me embody confidence, that can help me, like, I know that there are people here that think that I don't belong. And in fact, I don't belong. Okay, fine. What are things that I can do to bring about confidence? In my very first episodes, I had my sister circle on. And that was
I
a cool
love
episode.
those episodes. I love those. I
Yes.
love those.
They're my favorite. And so you may recall, like my sister circle, the oldest person in my sister circle just had her 60th birthday. The youngest person is 35. So and we came together through work mostly. So that's why there's such a big. Anyway, so the 60-year-old is talking about imposter syndrome as if it's back in the past. But she talks about the music that she listens to on her way to court. She says she doesn't really have imposter syndrome, blah, 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 but sometimes she's treated as if she doesn't belong. Most people know her now, so it's fine. But to pump herself up, she listens to some hype music in her car. Other people talked about calming music or sounds, candles and scents. I just talked about like somatics and just trying to be more in tune with my body and identify what it is that my body needs. Because it might be something as simple as I'm dehydrated, so let me drink some water.
Yeah.
Usually it's I'm tired, so let me drink some coffee. That's probably not the right answer. But are there nutrients that my body needs that are going to help me get through this moment? And then if it is something where I'm nervous, then just identifying that I'm nervous. What does nervousness feel like?
Yeah.
Like you were saying, does this feeling feel the same or different than something else? Does it feel like anxiety? Does it feel like fear? Does it feel like, and then playing the tape all the way through.
Yep.
Okay, so what's the worst that's going to happen today?
Yep.
Because I'm still leaving with my money. Like it might be bad, but we got a contract and I'm leaving with my money,
Right.
Other suggestions that I have that are fine for any of these, experiences that people have are support, having support that you can talk to, that you can get, that you can have this conversation, because sometimes we can be so in it that we don't even see that we're in it. With perfectionism, you may be a recovering perfectionist, but you might have had a relapse and you may not even know. You may
Yes.
be like so freaked out, and it's not about your ability to do the thing, it's about your ability to do the thing perfectly. And so figuring out, like, is perfection needed? Like, yes, if you are a surgeon, if you're a brain surgeon, if you're a heart surgeon, I'm gonna need perfection from you. And I'm also just gonna need you, if you can't do this perfectly, I'm gonna need you to bow out, okay? But most of us are not in positions where there needs to be perfection. So what is the MVP? What is the minimum viable product? What is the, I don't know, medium viable product? Like what's needed from us? And is that what we are expecting from ourselves, or are we expecting something else? And so getting out of this idea of I'm not valuable, I'm not worth it if I am not perfect.
I just thought of something that I think is helpful when this particular issue comes up and we are struggling to feel like we belong wherever we are, or we are struggling to believe that we know enough, or we're struggling to get it done because we're struggling to get it perfect. I want to offer an alternate definition of perfection. What if perfection is not about flawlessness? What if perfection means complete? Right? What if perfection means
Yes.
complete, not flawless, right? So going back to the minimum viable product. If you're an entrepreneur and you are starting off with your minimum viable product, it doesn't need to be perfect as in flawless, but you can get to a place where you are releasing a complete minimum viable product, right? So if you're trying to sell a
Mm-hmm.
car, your car should move, right? If it doesn't move, then it's not yet complete,
Yeah, it's a broken down
right?
car.
Right? But maybe complete for minimum doesn't involve having four doors, right? Maybe
Mm-hmm.
it's just a frame, right? And a roof to keep the rain off your head. Maybe that's all it
Mm-hmm.
is, right? Maybe the doors can come later. But figure out what complete looks like for the phase that you are trying to get through.
Ooh, gems.
Mm.
She is given gems right now. I love that reframing of perfection, because so much. So with podcasting, Elizabeth and I
Oh,
were talking about
yeah.
this earlier. There's like a million, it's just a million everything. Any decision that you can make with podcasting, there's a million of them. And at some point you have to choose one. If you don't choose one, you will not produce the podcast. There will be no podcast.
Yep.
And so when I was starting Impostrix Podcast, I would have loved that advice of like, is it complete? Yes? Great. Send it out there. Because
Yep.
if I'm waiting for perfection, I am the type of perfectionist that if I'm waiting for that, it's not happening. It's not happening because it's never going to be perfect enough for me. Like, it's
Yeah,
never.
I was in that spiral. I actually tell this my story of how I became a podcaster as episode 1 of my show. Yes, I had to get myself out of the I need to release a perfect podcast for on day 1, and not just release a perfect episode, right? But I needed to choose the perfect podcast platform. I needed to choose the perfect equipment, right? I had to have the perfect editing style. I needed the perfect theme song. Like I needed all the things and all the different elements to be perfect. And I had to get myself to a point of no, I just need to be complete because this is my starting point. not my ending point, and I am leaving room for growth. And so I was able to get episode 1 out, which, funny enough, when I recorded it, I was calling it episode 0 in my head because I was like, this is the throwaway episode that doesn't count. And then it was like maybe the week after I had recorded it, I was at a co-working space, and one of the people there, she happens to be a professional podcast manager. And so I was telling her, I was like, oh, I'm getting ready to do a thing, and I'm getting ready to launch my own podcast. And, I started recording like my first 2 episodes and blah, 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 blah. And I was telling her my whole plan for season 1. And she was like, sounds wonderful. Like, you're super organized. But just one thing, she was like, there's no such thing as episode 0. And I was like, no, 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 you don't understand what I mean. What I mean is, and she was like, no, 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 no. Trust me on this. This is something I know. There is no such thing as episode 0. And I had already recorded it. And in the
I have an episode 0.
Listen, she said it doesn't exist. So in my head, I was like, okay, what the expert just told me episode 0 isn't a thing. And I had to ask myself, do I go back and re-record this episode? Because that was going to reopen up the whole, like, do it again, do it right. At that point, I still didn't know how to edit. So it was a struggle. Episode 1 has a very different quality than any other episode of my show. It does. It has a different quality. It was the first one. I had no idea what I was doing. And after that, I did things differently, right? I chose not to re-record. I was like, I'm going to let this be the lesson.
Yeah.
And it becomes part of the journey. And yep, that's why you hear me referring to episode 0, and the title says episode 1 on the Life Edit Project podcast. And that the name of the episode is Confessions of a Chronic Overachiever.
Oh, nice. Yeah, no, mine still, I was just thinking to myself, well, shoot. So if I change my episode 0 to episode 1, then I got to change everything else.
Yeah. So what we're not going to do is that. We're going to carry our lessons forward, not backwards. Okay. This feels like a nice place to close out. Y'all really don't know how much chatting Whitney and I have done before we hit record. I feel like I have to invite you back maybe next season, because there's so many more things we can talk about. And I think you have so much to add to my audience. But y'all, in the meantime, please go and check out her show, the Impostrix Podcast. I will link it up in the show notes because I think you all will benefit greatly. And Whitney, you've had some amazing guests on there, and I haven't listened to a lot of them. I'm a fan of your solo episodes that you've given up on.
No, don't listen to her.
Just my favorite. To them all.
Yes, listen to them all. But my favorite, there's one in there about the neuropsychology behind the impact of racism on the brains of Black women specifically. I have a mini season about imposter syndrome or imposter experiences that people experience who are returning to career from prison and jail. So that was really cool. And then this season is all about entrepreneurship, Black business ownership. And so it has a lot of really great nuggets around like how we do this thing.
Yes, so good. So y'all, there you have it. There's some for your listening pleasure. Add those to your playlist. Where else can people go to connect with you, to find out more about you? Give me the info.
Yes. So my Instagram for the podcast, it's at Impostrix Podcast. Impostrix is IMPOSTRIX. So Impostrix Podcast. I do have a Facebook community, Impostrix Podcast, that I am going to spend more attention and time on moving forward. And then if you're interested in like legal stuff, Wills for the People is the name of my firm. You can also find me on Instagram at Wills for the People.
Fabulous. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you so much for this amazing conversation. Y'all, tune in next week. I will be back with another episode and maybe another special guest. You never know. Thank you so much.
Hey, Thanks for tuning into this week's episode. If you have a question or a favorite insight from today's conversation, I would love to hear from you. Send me a message on social media. I'm in all the places. My handle is @LifeEditProject, all one word. And of course, my accounts are linked up in the show notes to make it easy for you. So holla at your girl. I'll be back in your ears next week with a fresh episode. Make sure that you are subscribed to the Life Edit Project podcast wherever you like to listen so that you don't miss a thing. Until then, peace.